The city was alive with sounds, the screech of tires on pavement, the distant murmur of a crowd, the clinking of glass bottles being tossed into bins. But none of it mattered to the dog weaving through the labyrinth of alleys. Hunger was all he knew, all he cared about. His ribs pressed painfully against his skin, each step a reminder of how long it had been since he'd eaten anything more than scraps. His coat, once a smooth caramel brown, was now mottled with dirt and scars, souvenirs of battles he never chose to fight. Bruiser, that's what they used to call him. It wasn't a name born of affection, but of function. He was a tool, a weapon in the illegal dogfighting rings that thrived in the city's shadows. His early days of warmth and care, of being a puppy with a wagging tail, were distant memories, buried beneath layers of survival instinct and the raw, jagged pain of betrayal. The men who once cheered his victories had turned on him the moment he lost his edge. When he could no longer win, they threw him out like trash, expecting him to die on his own. But Bruiser was stubborn. He survived. The alley tonight was no different from the countless others he had wandered through since his escape. It smelled of decay, of oil slicks and garbage fermenting under the weight of time. His paws patted softly over the damp concrete as his nose guided him to a dumpster. He paused, sniffing, ears twitching at the faintest sound. A rustle, a squeak. He lunged, startling a rat that darted out of reach. Bruiser growled, frustrated, his stomach twisting painfully. He clawed at the trash, scattering empty cans and wilted lettuce. Nothing. Again. His head drooped as he moved further into the alley, his legs trembling from exhaustion. The faint glow of a street lamp barely illuminated his path. The air was cold, biting at the open scars on his body. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, blending with the hum of the city. He had learned long ago that no one would come for him. No one cared about a broken dog. And then he heard it, a sound so faint, it almost blended with the noise of the wind whistling through the buildings. He froze, his ears pricking forward. It wasn't a rat or the shuffle of garbage. It was higher-pitched, rhythmic, and human. A cry. Bruiser tilted his head, his nose twitching. His instincts screamed at him to move on. This sound didn't promise food or safety. It wasn't his concern, but something about it tugged at a part of him he thought had died long ago. Slowly, cautiously, he followed the noise. The sound grew louder as he approached the end of the alley, where the glow of a neon sign barely reached. There, near a stack of cardboard and an overturned crate, he saw it, a small bundle. It moved slightly, and the cry became clearer, more desperate. He stopped uncertain. His nose twitched, picking up a strange, unfamiliar scent. It wasn't food, but it wasn't danger either. It smelled fragile. The bundle shifted again, and a tiny arm emerged from the blanket, flailing weakly. Bruiser stepped closer, his paws silent on the damp ground. He lowered his head, sniffing cautiously. The cry stopped abruptly, replaced by soft, hiccuping whimpers. The tiny human, a baby, turned its head toward him, its eyes barely open. Bruiser froze. He had seen humans of all kinds, the cruel ones who used him, the indifferent ones who passed him by without a glance, the rare kind ones who sometimes threw scraps his way. But this was something else entirely. This little creature was helpless, smaller than anything he'd ever encountered, and it was looking at him with a trust he didn't deserve. The baby whimpered again, its tiny fists clenching and unclenching. The blanket around it was thin, barely enough to shield it from the night's chill. A gust of wind swept through the alley, and the baby shivered. Bruiser hesitated, his instincts warring with something deeper, something unfamiliar. He was hungry, cold, and exhausted. This wasn't his problem. He should leave, but he didn't. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the ground beside the baby, his body curling protectively around the small bundle. The baby's cries subsided, replaced by soft murmurs. Bruiser shifted, using his nose to nudge the blanket closer around the child. He wasn't sure why he was doing this. Maybe it was the faint memory of warmth, of being cared for once upon a time. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe, deep down, he was just tired of being alone. The night deepened, the city sounds fading into a distant hum. Bruiser stayed awake, his ears twitching at every noise, every shadow that moved. The baby slept fitfully, its small chest rising and falling against the thin fabric. The cold seeped into Bruiser's bones, but he didn't move. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about himself. He would protect this fragile life, even if he didn't know how. Somewhere above, the first drops of rain began to fall, and Bruiser tightened his curl around the baby. His eyes remained open, scanning the dark alley, as if daring the night to try and take the child from him. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything for both of them. The first light of dawn crept over the city, its pale beams slipping through the cracks between buildings and the gaps in the alley's cluttered walls. Bruiser stirred as the warmth of the baby's tiny body against his side shifted. The baby's eyes fluttered open, and a weak, uncertain cry escaped its lips. Bruiser lifted his head, his ears twitching, and nudged the baby gently with his nose. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to remind him of the night before. The cries, the helplessness, the way he had found himself acting on an instinct he didn't fully understand. The baby's cries grew louder, its tiny fists flailing against the air. Bruiser whimpered low in his throat, stepping back slightly. He didn't know what to do. The sound tugged at his gut, gnawed at him, just as hunger had gnawed at him for days. But this was different. The hunger was his own, something he'd long since accepted. This, though, this helpless, vulnerable creature, needed something more than what Bruiser could provide. The dog paced in tight circles, his nails clicking softly on the concrete. The morning air was crisp, but it carried more than just the scent of the previous night's rain. Bruiser's nose caught the faint smell of cooking. A bakery, maybe, or a street vendor setting up for the morning rush. His stomach growled loudly. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper meal. Instinctively, he turned toward the scent, his body swaying with exhaustion. Then the baby cried again, louder this time, its voice breaking into hiccups. Bruiser froze. He glanced back at the child, tucked awkwardly in its thin blanket and nestled against the base of the dumpster. The baby's face was scrunched, red, and damp with tears. It shivered. Bruiser whined softly, his ears flattening against his head. The scent of food still lingered in the air, taunting him, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he circled back to the baby, nudging the blanket closer with his nose. The baby's cries softened, though it still whimpered weakly. Bruiser lay back down beside it, curling his body protectively around the small bundle once again. The moment the baby quieted, he was hit by another wave of confusion. Why was he doing this? Why hadn't he simply walked away? He had spent so much of his life avoiding attachments, avoiding pain. And yet here he was, tethered to something that had no way to help him in return. Hours passed. The city stirred awake, the hum of engines and the chatter of early risers filling the air. Bruiser perked up when he heard footsteps, a pair of heavy boots echoing against the alley walls. A man appeared at the far end, his head bent as he carried a garbage bag to the dumpster. Bruiser tensed, his body coiled like a spring. People rarely reacted kindly to a stray dog, let alone one that looked like him. His scars, his matted fur, they made him an easy target for suspicion. But he didn't care about himself. His eyes flicked to the baby. The man drew closer, grumbling under his breath as he tossed the bag into the dumpster. He paused, noticing the bundle on the ground, and leaned in for a closer look. Bruiser growled low in his throat, stepping between the baby and the man. The man froze, his eyes widening. "Whoa," he muttered, holding up his hands. "Easy there, buddy." Bruiser didn't move, his growl rumbling softly as he lowered his head. The man took a cautious step back, muttering something about crazy dogs and turning on his heel. Bruiser watched him leave, his ears swiveling to track every sound until the man's footsteps faded completely. The baby stirred again, its small hand brushing against Bruiser's side. The dog glanced down, his expression softening. He didn't know much about humans, at least not the good ones, but he knew enough to understand that the baby wouldn't survive here much longer. The blanket was thin, The air was cold, and there was no food. Bruiser's stomach growled again, but he ignored it. The baby needed food more than he did. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from the hours he had spent lying on the hard ground. His nose twitched, catching the faint scent of bread again. He glanced at the baby, then at the mouth of the alley. Could he leave it here, just for a moment? The thought made him hesitate. He paced in small circles, whining softly, before finally settling on a plan. The baby was nestled securely in its blanket, the edges of the cardboard boxes forming a makeshift shelter. Bruiser sniffed the area one last time, ensuring there were no immediate dangers, before he stepped out of the alley. His movements were quick and cautious, his eyes darting to every shadow and corner as he followed the scent of food. It didn't take long to find the source. A bakery on the corner of the street, its windows fogged with the warmth of ovens. Bruiser approached cautiously, his tail low and his body tense. The smells were overwhelming. Fresh bread, sweet pastries, even a hint of meat. His mouth watered, but he didn't move closer. He knew better than to get too close. Humans didn't take kindly to strays, especially ones that looked like him. He sat a few feet from the door, watching as customers came and went. Occasionally, someone would glance at him, but no one stopped. Minutes turned into an hour, and the hunger gnawed at him relentlessly. Finally, a young woman exited the shop, a brown paper bag in her hand. She paused when she saw him, her eyes narrowing. Bruiser tensed, ready to bolt if she yelled or threw something. Instead, she crouched down, reaching into the bag. She pulled out a small roll and tossed it toward him. "Here, boy," she said softly. Bruiser hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and the roll. When she didn't move, he crept forward, snatching the bread before retreating a safe distance. The bread was gone in seconds, but it wasn't enough. His thoughts immediately returned to the baby waiting for him in the alley. It needed more than bread. Bruiser lingered for a moment, hoping the woman might give him more, but she was already walking away. He turned and ran back to the alley, his mind racing. He didn't know how, but he needed to find a way to help the baby survive. The rain came without warning, first as a drizzle that speckled the ground, then as a relentless downpour that drowned the sounds of the city. The sharp patter of raindrops echoed through the alley as Bruiser stood protectively over the baby, his scarred body shielding the fragile bundle from the cold water that pooled around them. The baby stirred, letting out soft cries that mingled with the roar of the storm. Bruiser whimpered, nudging the edge of the blanket closer around the child with his nose, but it wasn't enough. The rain was soaking through, and the baby's cries grew louder, its body trembling against the chill. Bruiser felt a rising panic. His instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed at him to find shelter. He couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable, but the weight of responsibility kept him frozen in place. He barked into the empty alley, a sound that was more desperate than threatening, hoping someone, anyone, might hear him. But the storm swallowed his cries, and no one came. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the alley in a flash of white light. The baby flinched, its tiny fists clenching as it let out a high-pitched wail. Bruiser barked again, his ears flattening against his head. The storm wasn't letting up, and staying here wasn't an option. He stepped away from the baby, pacing in tight, frantic circles as his mind raced. He needed to act. He needed to move. With a cautious glance down the alley, Bruiser lowered his head and grabbed the edge of the blanket in his teeth. He tugged gently, lifting the baby just enough to pull the bundle into a more secure position. The baby's cries softened slightly, though it still whimpered. Bruiser growled low in his throat, not in aggression, but determination. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay here. Step by step, Bruiser moved through the rain-soaked alley, the baby cradled awkwardly in the makeshift sling of the blanket. The weight wasn't much, but it felt significant, a responsibility that pressed down on him as heavily as the rain. The water pooled around his paws, cold and slick, but he pressed on, his head low to shield the baby from the worst of the storm. The city streets were eerily empty, the usual morning bustle subdued by the relentless rain. Bruiser navigated the maze of alleys and side streets, his senses on high alert. The baby whimpered occasionally, its small sounds barely audible over the storm. Bruiser paused under an overhang, setting the baby down briefly to catch his breath. His chest heaved as he panted, the rain dripping from his soaked fur. He nuzzled the baby gently, his warm breath offering a small comfort in the cold. As he stood there, his ears perked at a sound in the distance, a faint rumble, not of thunder, but of an engine. He stepped out from under the overhang, his sharp eyes scanning the street. A set of headlights appeared through the rain, growing brighter as they approached. Bruiser barked, his voice loud and urgent. The car slowed, its tires splashing through the puddles, and stopped a few feet away. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out, his silhouette illuminated by the headlights. He was tall, with a worn coat that barely kept the rain at bay. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but kind. He squinted through the downpour, his gaze locking onto Bruiser. "What's this?" the man muttered, stepping closer. His boots splashed in the water as he moved cautiously, his eyes darting between Bruiser and the bundle on the ground. Bruiser growled low, his body tense. He wasn't sure if the man was a threat, but he wasn't going to let anyone harm the baby. The man froze, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy, boy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Bruiser's growl softened, but he didn't move. The man crouched, lowering himself to Bruiser's level, and tilted his head to get a better look at the bundle. His eyes widened as he realized what it was. "A baby," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "Well, where did you come from?" The baby let out a small cry, drawing the man's full attention. He reached out hesitantly, his hands trembling as he pulled the bundle closer. The blanket was damp, the baby's face pale and streaked with rain. "Oh, God," the man muttered, wrapping the baby in his coat. "You're freezing." Bruiser watched him closely, his muscles still coiled with tension. The man glanced at him, a mixture of amazement and gratitude in his eyes. "You found him, didn't you?" he said softly. "You've been protecting him." Bruiser barked once, as if to confirm the man's words. The man nodded, cradling the baby tightly. "All right," he said, standing slowly. "Let's get him somewhere safe." He turned toward the truck, gesturing for Bruiser to follow. The dog hesitated, his eyes flicking between the man and the open door of the vehicle. The baby let out another weak cry, and Bruiser made his decision. He bounded toward the truck, leaping into the passenger seat as the man climbed into the driver's side. The warmth of the truck's interior was a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside. The man turned on the heater, directing the vents toward the baby, who nestled deeper into the man's coat. Bruiser sat stiffly, his eyes never leaving the child. The man glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're a good dog," he said. "A damn good dog." The truck rumbled to life, and the man drove through the rain, his destination clear in his mind. He didn't know who had abandoned the baby or why, but he knew one thing for certain. This child had survived the night because of the dog sitting beside him. And now, it was up to him to make sure the baby survived the rest of the journey. Bruiser lay down in the passenger seat, his body still trembling from the cold and exhaustion. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to relax. The baby was safe, and that was all that mattered. The road stretched ahead, winding through the rain, and Bruiser watched it silently, ready to face whatever came next. At the hospital, the bright fluorescent lights and bustling hallways created a stark contrast to the dim, rain-soaked streets Bruiser and the baby had come from. The emergency room buzzed with activity. Doctors and nurses hurried past, pushing carts and tending to patients. But everything seemed to pause when Hank, the man who had found them, walked through the doors carrying the tiny, shivering bundle. A nurse at the front desk looked up, her face shifting from fatigue to shock as she noticed the baby in Hank's arms. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing toward him. "Is that a baby?" Hank nodded, his voice shaky but firm. "Found him in an alley. This dog." He glanced behind him at Bruiser, who stood at the entrance, his fur still soaked and matted. "This dog saved him, kept him alive through the storm." The nurse's eyes flicked to Bruiser, a mix of astonishment and compassion in her gaze. "We need to get the baby inside now," she said, her professionalism kicking in. She waved to another nurse, and within seconds, a team was surrounding the baby, carefully transferring him to a warm blanket and checking his vitals. The baby's faint cries echoed through the room, a small but powerful sign of life. Hank hesitated as the medical team whisked the baby away, disappearing through a set of double doors. He turned to look at Bruiser, who stood by the entrance, watching intently but not moving. Hank crouched down, patting his knees. "Come on, boy. You've done your part. Let's get you dry." Bruiser didn't move at first, his eyes fixed on the doors where the baby had been taken. But Hank's steady voice coaxed him forward. The dog stepped cautiously into the hospital, his claws clicking softly on the linoleum floor. The warmth of the building enveloped him, and for the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't cold. A security guard approached, his brow furrowed as he noticed the large, scarred dog. "Sir, is this your dog?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Hank hesitated, glancing at Bruiser. "Not exactly," he admitted, "but he's the reason that baby's alive. He stayed with the kid all night, kept him warm, and led me to him." The guard's expression softened, and after a moment he nodded. "Well, I think he's earned a little leeway. Just make sure he doesn't cause any trouble." Bruiser stayed close to Hank's side as they were led to a small waiting area. A kind receptionist handed Hank a towel, and he used it to gently pat Bruiser's fur, trying to dry him off. The dog leaned into the touch, his body relaxing slightly. For the first time in days, he felt safe. Hours passed. Hank dozed off in a chair, his coat draped over his lap, but Bruiser stayed awake, his ears twitching at every sound. He wasn't used to this kind of environment. Bright lights, constant noise, the strange, sterile smells. But he didn't let it overwhelm him. His focus remained on the double doors, waiting for any sign of the baby. Finally, a doctor emerged, her expression tired but relieved. She approached Hank, gently waking him. "The baby is stable," she said. "He's severely undernourished and dehydrated, but he's going to be okay." Another few hours in that cold, though, and it might have been a different story. Hank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank God," he murmured. He glanced at Bruiser, who was now sitting upright, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "You hear that, boy? He's going to be okay." The doctor crouched down, looking at Bruiser with a mix of curiosity and admiration. "So this is the hero dog," she said, her voice gentle. "He's the one who stayed with the baby?" Hank nodded. "He didn't just stay. He protected him, barked at anyone who came near, and wouldn't leave his side." The doctor reached out cautiously, letting Bruiser sniff her hand before she scratched behind his ears. "You're a remarkable dog," she said softly. Bruiser leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing as the tension in his body melted away. Word of Bruiser's actions spread quickly. By the next morning, local news stations were covering the story. A stray dog had saved an abandoned baby during a violent storm. Reporters flocked to the hospital, eager to learn more about the mysterious dog. Nurses and doctors stopped by the waiting room just to see him, offering treats and words of praise. Bruiser didn't understand the fuss. He was just glad the baby was safe. Social services were contacted, and an investigation into the baby's abandonment began. While the authorities worked to determine the child's origins, the hospital staff took to calling him Noah, a name inspired by his survival against the odds. Noah became a symbol of hope, a reminder of resilience, and the unexpected kindness that could emerge from the most unlikely places. As for Bruiser, his life took an unexpected turn. A local animal shelter heard about his story and sent a representative to the hospital to evaluate him. The woman who arrived, a young veterinarian named Claire, was struck by his scars and his cautious demeanor. She knelt in front of him, speaking softly as she examined him. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she murmured, running her hand gently over his battered frame. "But you've got a good heart. That much is clear." Claire offered to take Bruiser in, but Hank hesitated. "I don't think he's just any dog," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I think he and that baby, I think they're connected." The idea seemed absurd at first, but as the days passed, it became clear that Bruiser wasn't just a stray anymore. Every time Noah was brought into the waiting room for visitors, Bruiser's eyes lit up. The baby would reach for him, giggling softly, and Bruiser would respond with a wag of his tail and a gentle nuzzle. The bond between them was undeniable. When Noah was discharged from the hospital and placed into foster care, Hank made a decision. He applied to become both Noah's foster parent and Bruiser's official owner. It wasn't an easy process. Hank's life as a drifter meant he had little to offer in terms of stability. But with the help of local charities and the attention surrounding Bruiser's heroism, Hank found a way to rebuild his life. Months turned into years. Noah grew strong and healthy under Hank's care, and Bruiser became his constant companion. The scars on Bruiser's body faded, though the memories of his past lingered. But in Noah's laughter and the warmth of a safe home, he found something he never thought possible: peace. The two were inseparable. Bruiser followed Noah everywhere, his protective instincts as sharp as ever. At night, he would curl up at the foot of Noah's bed, his ears twitching at every sound, as if to say, "I'm still here. I'll always be here." Their story became a legend in the small town, a tale of survival, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. And for Bruiser, the scarred survivor who once wandered the streets alone, life had finally become something worth fighting for.